Today we're going to talk about the naming strategy. It's within the brand strategy building block within our strategic marketing playbook. So let's jump in. First, here are the four building blocks, just to refresh your memory. What we're talking about, as I said, is the brand strategy. It defines what you want to stand for and, among people for years and years and years, and you do evaluate it about every 5 years. And especially if you're adding new products, names, brands, you definitely would want to review the naming strategy. But there it is, right around the brand architecture. We'll note later as well that oftentimes the brand architecture and naming strategy go hand in hand. So what is a naming strategy? It's a structure, it's an organization, and guidelines for how and where you use names in your portfolio so people can easily understand what's being offered. It includes brands, products, and services. Anything that you name can fit within this. It's usually completed after the brand architecture is defined, as I mentioned just a second ago. Here's an example of a brand name. Here's a naming strategy. It's within their brand architecture, but really if you look at how they name, they have the Ritz-Carlton, and those are the luxury hotels. Then they have like the JW Marriott and the Renaissance, and those are how they name their contemporary quality hotels. They have their quality destinations two different ways, Marriott Hotels and Resorts, and then the Courtyard Marriott. Then you'll see their extended stay and how they name those, their executive apartments, their town place suites and the Residence Inn, and you see the Value Hotel with the Fairfield Inn. So all of them have a little bit different within their brand architecture as well. Let's look at a product example. Look at Tesla. Lots of cars do a very similar way, is they'll say, okay, what's my model or number or type or name, and they put everything in a consistent format so that people understand. That's the whole point of that. Lastly, service, and I know this is small, but if you look at Deloitte as an example, they have their cloud offerings. A lot of times with services, you get really specific to the exact service because it can be super confusing if you don't. So they have cloud strategy and readiness. They have SaaS implementation, custom implementation, cloud migration, Deloitte Cloud Solutions, and cloud enablement and managed services. So the service names are all super specific and they're pretty descriptive. But let's talk about that. So how do you develop a naming strategy? First, you have to develop a criteria for what you want. How do you want to organize it? What are you trying to say to people? Are you trying to show differences in what things do? Are you trying to show different levels? Are you trying to show something that is much more superior than something else? You document and categorize your current names. Put it on paper. It's amazing what that will do. Then you benchmark others for inspiration. We almost always look at competition, but then also look outside the category. Maybe it's a category you just think is interesting and relevant and asks people to choose. It's all about making decisions and helping them choose you. So how do other people help their ideal targets choose? And then you identify any gaps. Okay, what seems to be working with the benchmarking and what you thought you wanted and what you've got. Then you develop your options. A lot of times you'll get a whole suite of names and say, okay, here are a bunch of names in this type of category. Here's a bunch of names in a different type of category. And then from there, you get feedback, you refine, and you finalize. Now, let's say you have your strategy, you have your idea. How do you create names within the strategy? It's to help people understand the relationship with those brands, products, and services. It's helpful to be consistent in the types of names you use. And here's what I mean. So here's in this chart, you'll see several different types of names, everything from generic to fanciful. On the right side, you'll see some of those examples. Generic, it could identify an entire class or category of products or services, like hotels.com and cars.com. Descriptive, it immediately conveys an idea of ingredients, qualities, or characteristics of the product or the service. Flat rate moving, 3-day blinds, like it's pretty obvious. It's suggestive. It evokes a characteristic of the underlying good of the brand. Greyhound, I bet that's fast. Coppertone, I bet you get tanned. Purell, I bet it's pure, and I bet it helps you be clean. It's arbitrary, real words used out of context. Apple, can you imagine the people who first came up with that name? It's not as obvious Then, it wasn't as obvious then as it is now. And then Quaker. Fanciful, it's invented, it has no meaning. Like Kodak, Xerox, and even Google. It's helpful to pick one of these or a couple of these or a hybrid of these so that when you have a variety of names, that it's consistent. That's all you're trying to do, is make it easy for people to process and understand what you are trying to name and what you're trying to say. So here's an example. We worked with a company that did machine work holding products. These are things that you use in a machine shop, and they needed to name them. And they were talking to machinists and also the shop owner. So the guidelines, we needed to help explain the benefit of the product, so the solution to the problem. We needed the suggested of ideals we want the customers to attribute to the brand, and we needed to stay consistent with category naming norms. They bought a lot out of catalogs, so you couldn't get too out of control because it was a pretty specific type of category you had to play within. Structure for creating the name. First, you start with the benefit or how it works. Then you added what it does, and that came up with the name. So here's an example. The final naming strategy included their main name was Reed Machining Innovations. They had the Sure Stop, the Stop Clear, and the Max Clamp. And all of those, to the audience, maybe not to you and me, but to the audience, made sense on what those products did. So what about brand architecture and naming strategy? Brand architecture for Cancer Wellness is the master brand, and here's what it was. Then they had their naming strategy. They had 4 cornerstones, and they all incorporated for wellness. Then they had their supplement names, and they described the benefits, as you can see. So they had the 4 cornerstones there: activity for wellness, nutrition for wellness, support for wellness, and mindset for wellness. And then we had their supplements. And you'll see for every day: for bones, for energy, for hair, for nausea, brain, for pain, for skin, for teeth. Whether you like it or not, it's consistent. And we aligned on it so that it is really clear, if you're going to have another name, how might you name that? So what's a good naming strategy? It's simple, but can it evolve to meet needs? It includes names that make sense in relation to each other. It includes names with a consistent type of name. It makes it easy to create names for new offerings. What's a good name? It's appropriate. It's distinctive. It's easy to say and spell. It's likable. It's extendable. And it's available. You'd be surprised the number of names that someone has already used, especially if you're trying to find a URL and you're trying to trademark it. So recap, let's talk about this naming strategy. It's within the brand strategy building block. It's a structure and guidelines for how and where you use names in the organization's portfolio so people can easily understand what's being offered, including brands, products, and services. And a good naming strategy is simple, can be evolved to meet needs, includes names that make sense in relationship to each other, includes names within a consistent type of name. It makes it easier to create names for new offerings. I hope that helps.